In the year 1759, a young man in Dublin signed a lease on an old, run-down brewery. Nothing about the moment looked historic, but the terms of that lease were so astonishing that people still talk about them today. He agreed to rent the property for 9,000 years. Not 90, not 900, 9,000 years at a fixed price, a length of time so absurd it sounds like a joke. And yet that single, audacious signature would give birth to one of the most famous names on earth, a dark drink poured in almost every country in the world. It would also give birth to a family fortune and to a shadow that would follow that family across the centuries, a run of tragedy so persistent that the world eventually gave it a name. They called it the curse. This is the story of the empire behind the world's most famous beer, and the price the family behind it seemed to keep paying, because power and money are never far apart. The name was Guinness, and it began with that one remarkable man and his impossible lease. His name was Arthur Guinness, and he was, by every account, a brilliant and determined businessman. He took that crumbling Dublin brewery and turned it into something extraordinary. He perfected a particular style of dark beer, rich and distinctive, and he built the operation up with such skill that it grew far beyond the city, far beyond Ireland, and eventually across the entire globe. Within a few generations, the family brewery had become one of the largest of its kind anywhere in the world, and the Guinness name had become synonymous with Ireland itself. The family grew immensely wealthy. They bought grand estates, married into the aristocracy, and rose into the very highest circles of British and Irish society. From a rented brewery to a global empire, they had built something that seemed truly indestructible. And the business, remarkably, was indestructible. The company thrived for more than 2 centuries, surviving wars, depressions, and every upheaval the modern world could throw at it. The dark beer kept pouring. The fortune kept growing. In terms of pure commerce, the Guinness story is one of the great, unbroken success stories in all of business history. But that is only half of the story. Because while the company flourished, generation after generation, something very different seemed to be happening to the people who carried the name. For alongside the triumph, the family endured a long, painful series of misfortunes, striking so many of its members across so many decades that observers began to speak of it as something more than chance. There were sudden, early deaths. There were tragic accidents. There were struggles with illness and with the kind of private pain that great wealth so often fails to prevent and sometimes seems to deepen. Bright young heirs, who seemed to have every advantage the world could offer, met untimely and sorrowful ends. It happened often enough and publicly enough that the newspapers seized upon it, and a phrase took hold that would haunt the family for the rest of the century: the Guinness curse. Consider the strange shape of it. Here was a family with almost everything: enormous wealth, titles, beautiful homes, entry into the most glittering society in the world. And yet, again and again, the private lives behind the grand doors were touched by loss. Young lives cut short, marriages and futures shattered. A sense, building over the generations, that the family's spectacular fortune had been paired somehow with an equally spectacular share of sorrow. Whether you believe in such things or not, to the people watching from the outside, it looked as though the family had struck some invisible bargain, gaining the empire, but paying for it in grief. The tragedies touched the family across many decades and many branches, from its grandest aristocratic members to its youngest heirs, and each fresh loss seemed to deepen the legend. Some of the family members who suffered were public figures. Their misfortunes played out in the headlines. Others suffered more quietly, away from the cameras. But the accumulation over time was hard to ignore, and the phrase stuck precisely because it seemed, to so many, to fit. A family blessed with one of the world's great fortunes and shadowed across generation after generation by an unusual measure of heartbreak. But now we have to stop and think clearly about what a curse really is, because honesty demands it, and the truth here matters. The idea of a family curse is, of course, a story we tell ourselves, a way of making sense of pain that has no neat explanation. And when you look closely, a great deal of the Guinness tragedy is, sadly, what happens to any very large family over 2.5 centuries. The family was enormous, spread across many branches and hundreds of people over the years. Any group that size, followed for that long, will accumulate a heavy toll of accident and illness and early loss, simply through the mathematics of time and numbers. There was no supernatural hand at work. There was a very big, very famous family, watched more closely than almost any other, so that every misfortune became public and every death fed the legend. And yet, and this is the honest, uncomfortable part, wealth of that magnitude does carry its own real dangers, ones that are not supernatural at all. Extreme privilege can isolate people. It can remove the ordinary limits and pressures that keep lives on track. It can surround the young with temptation and with people who will not say no to them. The Guinness heirs, like the heirs of many great fortunes we have explored, sometimes struggled with exactly these things, the burdens that come quietly, attached to inherited money. So perhaps the truth is gentler and sadder than a curse. Not a supernatural punishment, but the ordinary human cost of a very unordinary amount of wealth, multiplied across a very large family over a very long time. And that is the real lesson hiding behind the world's most famous beer. We look at a family like the Guinnesses and we see only the empire, the estates, the glamour, the name on every pint in every pub. We imagine that such a fortune must be an unbroken blessing. But behind the grand doors, the same money that built the empire could not shield the family from grief, and may, at times, have quietly added to it. The company Arthur Guinness founded still thrives, more than 2.5 centuries on, exactly as that impossible 9,000-year lease seemed to promise. The family that built it discovered, across the generations, that no lease, however long, and no fortune, however great, can buy a single day of protection from sorrow, because power and money are never far apart. Discovery continues.